and fire away. Okay, several up here, one here, two. Okay, to start out.
Charles Weiss from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I wonder if the panelists would like to expand on the political aspects of this. The policy recommendations boil down to new financial institutions and codes and standards. Who's going to be for these things and who's going to be against them?
I plead lots of ignorance on Washington and turn to my distinguished colleague, Mr. Bergsten.
No, I'll ask Trevor, who knows this. Trevor knows this business better than I do.
The question is how to make the Congress move.
And unfortunately, given my current predicament, I'm not going to be able to comment on it. So
we got three of us ducked.
We will therefore ask the audience, as you comment on all these things, to answer Chuck's question. I'll go to the back. Jacob, and then I'll come back up to the front. Jacob, you might answer some of that, too.
Well, I think the answer is not very many. But let me applaud the authors for this study, because I think it's a great one, and there's a lot in it that, if you so to speak, warms my European heart, because it basically, to me, shows that just as we discovered in the financial sector that it's a flawed way of thinking, that we can just rely on incentives and self-interest to, steer behavior, the same seems to be true, and this seems to be the gist of this study, that the same is true when we're talking about abatement of emissions in the building, in buildings at least, that it's flawed just to rely on market incentives, and therefore we need these codes codes of regulation. But my first question was actually already asked. I mean, isn't this socialism? I mean, who's going to support it? So I will not ask that again. But I want to ask the panelists a broader question, and this particularly to the representative from the WBCSD, is that your stance on climate change and these issues seems to me to be very much at odds with the sort of mainstream U.S. business stance, where, I mean, it was announced yesterday, for instance, that PG&E decided to leave the Chamber of Commerce over irreconcilable differences of that interest group stance over climate change. And I was wondering if you had any comments on what the role for U.S. businesses to push this agenda going forward.
George, why don't you say something about that, and even maybe come back and try to answer some of that first question, because you've made the call for codes and standards, and I know how familiar you've been with those over the years in your own business. And to share with us a bit, what is the resistance to implementing those codes and standards that you call for? What is the political difficulty with getting some of those done?
Well, first, I want to rise to the socialism label quickly, and I think there's an easy connect about that. And the way we resolve that is that nobody thinks about socialism or any other political or system of political organization when we talk about building life safety codes. We take that as for granted. We take it for granted that we will incur costs to protect people's lives. And we've done it in buildings, and you can see it. You have to look at some of this body of code literature that applies to buildings. Air quality, fire safety, elevators, everything like that says you got to build a safe building. And I'll give you rough numbers. Buildings cost about 5% more than they otherwise would because they're built to conform to these building life safety codes. And it's not even a topic of debate. And also because it's 100 years mature, we've got the friction out of the system, so you actually have got working code writing authorities and mechanisms. They take the force of regulation typically because they go through the American National Standards Institute. They get adopted by individual municipalities and by building departments, not necessarily by states, but they've gone all the way down to the people that actually do a permit. And you cannot get a permit to do significant construction in the United States in virtually any jurisdiction without a building department permit. And that's because you've got this century-long maturity process. We said building life safety is important, and we're going to have permits, and this is how it's going to work. And we've got 100 years to figure it out. And we're, I think, on the front end of that with building energy efficiency. And that's why there's a lot of friction, and everything else in this system, and why it doesn't actually work out. There's one place where it might come in a pretty big way, which is Mayor Bloomberg's Plan YC. That's you recall, was launched a couple of years ago when they had the Conference of Mayors in New York. I guess it was in May of 2005 or 2006. And he's actually gone on to do that, and they are rewriting for the first time since 1968, and I think it's done now, the New York City Buildings Code. And it's going to have a big buildings energy efficiency component in it, and it will have the force of inspection mechanism and also annual inspection to ensure compliance going forward. So I think the answer is, and also I guess maybe if I could go on just for another minute here, Fred, this is since I'm maybe the person closest to the business sector speaking here, I can tell you that there is in my judgment, there's a material and huge shift in the thinking of business people about climate change in the last 12 months. This has gone from here to here. And you get I think you got very few people that would say that in business that we don't have a climate change problem and that we can continue living as we have been living in the past. I think people are more and more aware. We'll here's a specific metric. Sustainability reports. This population might not think about that, but that's something corporate America does. We write an annual report to shareholders, which is financial and business, and we write a sustainability report, which runs to corporate citizenship. And it's a whole bunch of metrics like compliance with environment, health, and safety regulations, community participation, and things like this. And 8 years ago, I don't think there was more than one company in the Fortune 100 that did a sustainability report, and today it's like half. And that's a good metric to say that people are running businesses to a different standard today than they did a bunch of years ago. I'm old enough that I can say this with some authority, which is you cannot imagine the difference of professionalism then, that is 1975 when I first went to work in Otis Elevator Company versus now 2009. 34 years different, and it was real different. And the professionalism, the corporate citizenship, the obligations, the disclosure, the transparency that is attendant to a big, good American company today is breathtaking. And the change, more breathtaking still.
There was another question right up here, yeah.
Excellent presentations today. Thank you. Cliff Majerzik, the Institute for Market Transformation. I have a comment and a question. The comment is building on what you said about building codes. The Waxman-Markey bill and the Senate bills, they do strengthen the building energy codes here in the United States. But speaking to what you said before, I think more importantly, the Waxman-Markey bill would provide hundreds of millions of dollars in annual funding for local building departments to enforce those codes. Because as you say, most building departments right now do not enforce the codes even if they have them on their books, and they just don't have the capability to do so. They need the resources, and they also need sort of a carrot and stick to push them in that direction. The question I have, building on what you said before about Plan YC, my organization works for jurisdictions around the country, including we're working with Mayor Bloomberg's office on the New York plan. And one of the bills, the most controversial of the four bills that he's proposing to improve the energy efficiency of buildings, would require that there be energy audits and retro-commissioning of commercial buildings every 10 years, and that all cost-effective, that is, all energy efficiency improvements that would pay off in a timely manner, and I think they're defining that as sort of cash flow positive, would have to be made by the building owner, and they'll provide some finance to help building owners finance that. I'm curious if you think that's a good policy, if you can say anything about it, and another policy that's part of that they're working on and that we have here in Washington, D.C., that we help put here and in California, which requires that you have to annually Energy Star benchmark your building and publicly disclose that. There's a split incentive problems that you talked about. Most building tenants office tenants pay for the energy costs, and yet they have no idea whether or not the building that they're in is energy efficient. And they don't know that when they're shopping to lease a new building. People, when they're buying a building, don't know. So the idea is to sort of have a truth in advertising. People have to disclose how energy efficient their commercial buildings are. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those.
Do I do that? Okay. Well, first thing is, I know Waxman-Markey provides money for building departments, but I think that both, one, it's good, but it also makes a point, which is that the landscape today is you don't really have more than a handful of municipal jurisdictions in America that have effective building energy efficiency codes actually implemented with inspection and permitting mechanisms. We're just scratching the surface, and maybe the lesson for us in Washington is that on something so complicated as this, where you've got in the United States a couple 100 million decision makers or users of buildings and building energy efficiency systems, the implementation mechanisms are difficult. And we can decide something in the Congress today. By the time it actually gets done, could be a couple of decades from now. And so it's a long, hard push that we're embarking on, and it's good that we're getting started, but we have a ways yet to go. You mentioned audits and requirements actually to go do a retro basis, like did it work in New York, and requirements to actually do renovations where there are 10-year discounted paybacks, and I think those are all very good. I have not read in any kind of depth the Building Energy Efficiency Code that's coming out of New York right now. I've seen some commentaries on it. People, I think, generally regard it as comprehensive, effective, good, and with teeth. And you mentioned labeling. Labeling was a principal recommendation from the WBC SD work, and I just didn't cover it today, given time.
Okay, we got several in the back.
Let me add, Fred, maybe one thing to that. And
sure,
I can't comment on pending legislation or policy. Maybe I will rise a little bit to the defense of the market in this conversation. I think that George is right, and I mean our analysis based on the WBCSD model certainly shows that to get where you need to go, you're going to have standards at the end of the day. When you think about the kind of residential standard, now a standard is asking a household to do something that they have chosen not to do otherwise. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that. Maybe it's imperfect information or it's lack of capital. There are lots of folks who would be very eager in the types of rate of returns, having access to the types of rate of returns that George talked about in his presentation. And I think to the extent that we can connect pools of capital who are hungry for those rate of returns to efficiency opportunities that can provide them, that's going to create an incentive to actually improve efficiency so that you don't have to rely as much on code enforcement, standard enforcement. It can be a useful complement. I mean, when I look at my 401k right now, I would be really excited if some of my retirement investment could have access to those types of rate of returns. And that's difficult. I think there's some innovative approaches that are being tried out in utility business models and through ESCOs that I think are a promising complement to a codes and standards approach.
Okay, we got several folks in the back. Let's do three back there, and then we'll come back up front.
Thank you. Mark Finley with BP, and I'm happy to note that I work in a LEED certified building. Actually, Trevor, you started to touch on my question, which was I'm come away actually a bit confused after the two presentations. Complementary studies that seem to have gotten to the same bottom line, and yet your first option of policy interventions was market-based. You know, what can we do to get financial intermediaries into this space? And that could get us half the way there. Whereas George said, went right to, well, the markets don't work. The heck with that, let's just do the codes and standards. And yet, your own company cut emissions by 25% without being forced to eat those tighter standards. So I'm interested in this trade-off or tension between these two approaches, and I'd like to hear your thoughts more on that. Thank you.
I think that's what lawyers call a compound question. So I need to sort that out. Maybe the last question first, which is why we do 25%. And I think maybe a simple answer is that this company is more alert than most to energy saving, because even though our carbon footprint as a company is rather small, we're 2.2 million tons, which on the scale of things for a company our size is a relatively small carbon footprint. That's our own carbon footprint direct. The problem is that if everything we do uses energy to make useful work, whether it's an air conditioner or a heating system or an aircraft engine or a helicopter or an elevator. We sell things that take energy to make useful work. So we're very alert to the energy efficiency agenda, which has been actually a basis of marketing and technical performance comparisons for decades. So we kind of live in that environment. And in fact, if you look at the carbon footprint of our deployed equipment, it's big. It's really big because the stuff's very long-lived and it uses energy to make useful work. So it's not surprising to me that we paid attention to it. And then we got very early positive feedback. You just did stuff, and lo and behold, you go back to the board a year later and say, well, here's what happened to the carbon footprint. And it was pretty impressive without a lot of effort, a lot of money, just put a metric in place and do it. So I wouldn't say it was, I think our case was specific to our business and just some early good experiences and something we care a lot about citizenship, and I think many companies care about citizenship, but maybe many companies, like many consumers, haven't seen the kinds of returns, or they haven't seen the amount of goodness you can get relative to relatively low levels of expenditure and effort. So I guess that's one, and we hope that more awareness and more knowledge by more big companies will cause more and more and more of this. I think that, again, that metric, half the Fortune 100 does sustainability reports today where one did it 10 years ago. And if you do a sustainability report, you should report your carbon footprint. BP reports its carbon footprint, which is very good. Actually, for disclosure, I'm an independent director of BP. So, and I guess I've now lost the first two elements in the compound question.
We'll let Trevor pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to answer your question about sequencing, it's the Peterson Institute for International Economics, so I got to kick the tires of the market-based solution first and see how far that'll get us before turning to the alternatives. And I think that, I mean, it's not an either or, it's a basket. If you just went with standards and you didn't have any education, you didn't have any financial incentives, enforcement would be a real bear, right? Because people would have no knowledge of the benefits and would not have any interest in actually improving it themselves. If you just went with awareness and new approaches to efficiency financing, it seems pretty clear you're not going to get to where you need to go by 2050, all told. Now, 2050 is a long way out, but on current trajectories, it doesn't look like you're going to get there. So I think you have to have both of them. I think the question is, if the codes and standards are kind of setting the bar for where you need to be, how can you ensure that meeting those codes and standards happens in the cheapest way possible and is providing the most benefit for folks who have a vested interest in seeing us get there?
George, I'd like to...
I just for clarity, a sentence on that is I think this EEB, Energy Efficiency in Building study, really came out touching all three of these elements, and even a fourth that I think Trevor has appropriately added, which is we need a carbon cost. And my only point was that carbon cost is not the only solution because it's not going to get you from here to there. It also doesn't have as much impact as many people think it does. So I qualified carbon cost, but I would say we still need a cost of carbon. Secondly, so carbon cost is one. The second leg in all this is codes and standards, and you heard strong emphasis on that. The third leg is R&D to tune and to change the equations for the amount of savings you get relative to the investment you put in. And I think Trevor appropriately has done the fourth, which is better financing sources and better mechanisms to link investors and people that benefit from the savings that you get from lower energy and lower carbon footprint. And I might just note that ESCOs are a big piece of that. Actually, our own company, we bought a half dozen ESCOs in the last 5 years. And I think that's a whole big area. And maybe it's back to the $50 per month savings thing, that a consumer doesn't have the knowledge or want to take the time to go figure it out. The ESCO does.
George, I wanted to just push this line of thinking one step further, because I think it's critical to the whole issue. If I understood you right, the most stunning thing you said right toward the end of your remarks was that 91% of energy usage was wasted. And you attributed that to the fact that energy had essentially been free. But then you did say earlier, you've modified a little bit now, but you did say earlier that putting a price on carbon was, in your view, not the main reason, the main corrective to excessive use. Reconcile those two things for me.
Okay, and there is a quick resolution to that apparent inconsistency, in which we struggle with a whole lot inside this team, which is that a carbon cost of $30 to $40 a ton won't do it. And you need numbers more like we see in Europe in my opinion, you need carbon cost of 3-digit going up. And that's why I tend to go to codes and standards, because I don't believe that governments are going to step up to carbon costs of $100 a ton going up.
Okay, back to the back, and then we'll come up front.
I'm Anna Pavlova. I work for Johnson Controls. We are a big building efficiency company. We do everything from making air conditioners to retrofitting the Empire State Building. It's a deep retrofit that is going on right now. But I just wanted to share the three challenges that we have in building efficiency. And number one, you already mentioned, which is incentivizing the commercial sector, the commercial building owners. And we, as an ESCO, are happy to figure out how to transfer that model to the commercial sector. We do think, however, that the only way that's going to work is if we add the payback to the property tax, because that's transferable from one owner to the next, and maybe that will solve the problem at least partially. The second issue, the challenge that we have on the policy front, a lot of the money that goes into the incentives, the loans, the grants in the building efficiency sector right now goes to the states. The states obviously could do some great things, but we have a challenge. If we have a company, a large company that is in every state that wants to do projects everywhere where they want to do building efficiency in each of their buildings, they have to go to every state separately and deal with the rules and the regulations and the money there. And we think that maybe within the cap and trade system, there may be maybe it would be good to have a federal program that would allow for a national program and for companies to do that on a national scale. And the third one, and we do support the energy efficiency standard, and I do realize that intellectually a lot of people say we don't want any more standards. We have plenty. We already have the biofuels one. We don't want to go there. But I do think that in this world where we are going to have a renewable energy standard, probably we are at some point going to have cap and trade, energy efficiency standard can incentivize utilities and to do building efficiency. And also I think it can address issues like manufacturing efficiency, which is another piece of this that people rarely talk about. So efficiency for factories and plants. So these are our big issues, and I don't know whether you want to comment. I just wanted to say thank you for the report, because clearly between your data and what we are faced with, there's a lot of work, a lot of education that needs to be done, and sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Either of you want to comment on it? Okay. Next, Gary.
One quick political comment.
Please identify.
Gary Horlick, speaking for myself. One of the attractions of a lot of the things on the left-hand side of your diagram is it doesn't require people to move house. It doesn't require people to change the size of their house, to change the size of their yard, et cetera, all of which are different challenges, but politically much more ticklish. And so my thought would be to ask you why, if it's worthwhile categorizing some of your proposals that way. It's a lot easier to tell people that they can live in essentially the same house. I realize there's other debates about that, but a lot of your proposals don't require those kinds of hard choices. And that's one of its attractions, I would think.
And I would say virtually all of them don't. Yeah. This is modification to either new construction or existing structures.
Right.
Okay, we'll come back up front. Bill?
Bill Clyde from the Institute. Question for Trevor first, and then one for George. As I look at your figures, you've got 40% of the emissions are from buildings, but the fraction of the reductions called for is only 17% from buildings, at least in the IEA data. That seems to be if you argue that buildings are a particularly efficient way of cutting it, then why wouldn't it be 60% instead of 17%? There seems to be a contradiction there. I wonder if you could explain that. More broadly, for I guess either Trevor or George, it seems to me that there are some distinctions in the command and control approach. One is between retroactivity and future. And I'm wondering to what extent you're relying on a retroactive reconfiguration that raises interesting questions of, in a sense, property rights, especially if you look at Trevor's chart and you see a big chunk of that horizontal distance was in the residences and small offices. That crowd, in some sense, may be difficult to tell them that they have to do anything rather than respond to a price incentive. I can see a lot more feasibility of having the codes for new construction, whether it's corporate or residential. So I wonder if you could clarify whether this is an approach that requires retroactive mandatory refitting for each household. And then I guess the final point of this would be, if one's going to go this route, it would seem awfully desirable to have any code have a quite thorough analysis that specifies what is in some sense the marginal cost of doing this, because, you know, in the classic quantity versus price approach to environment, the quantity gives you more certainty, but you don't know what the price is going to be.
I'll take the first question, which is easy to dispatch with, and leave the second two for George. Of current emissions, if we say 40% from the building sector, we're taking both the direct emissions from fuels consumed on-site in a building, so like fuel oil or natural gas, and the indirect emissions from the electricity that's consumed, but the emissions are emitted at the power plant, right? So today, both of those numbers get you to 8.8 gigatons globally. And then the projection is that that grows to 20.1 gigatons. The 9.2 that we're talking about is just, or sorry, the 8.2 is just from the direct, it's just improving efficiency in the buildings. You're going to need an extra 9 gigatons from lowering the carbon intensity of the energy supply. So the building sector in the IEA forecast goes from 20.1 to 3, which is a reduction relative to its size, even a little larger than its size. The efficiency component of that, though, is only about half in the IEA's estimate. Now, some of the more recent modeling that the WBCSD folks have done have shown that you can even get more than 8.2 gigatons from the efficiency side, but that's the way the IEA breaks it down.
And Bill, I would say that the WBCSD work is substantially the same, because if you recall the chart I presented to you, about 8 gigatons comes out of decent financial return projects, 5 and 10-year discounted paybacks. And then we said we need another 7 to get from here to there to meet the 77% IEA reduction, or IPCC reduction. And we said that basically has no financial rate of return. And a big piece of that was solar, PV solar, on residences, which is essentially zero rate of return. And if you'd like, that kind of goes into decarbonizing the grid, because the assumption is that you both reduce power consumption when you have PV solar in a house, and also you put the excess PV solar back into the grid when you don't need it. So if you'd like, that's kind of grid decarbonization. I think the numbers are all consistent, and what it simply says is that if you want to go from 21 to 16, that's the building's carbon footprint, the first 8 is pretty straightforward and is warranted to do anyway. The next 8, a little bit more doubtful. And then you're back into more R&D funding and better technology, and steepen these cost curves so the equations change with the passage of time. I guess maybe the second question, which I think we've heard touched in several different ways. Trevor said he's a market economist because he's associated with Peterson. I would agree. I'm associated with Peterson. I'm a market economist too, and I started with carbon cost at the front end of this study 4 years ago. And I think what to me is persuasive, and I'm going to mention it one more time, is that we don't think about market solutions to building life safety at all. We just don't. We're going to have building life safety, and the cost is modest, and I think we need to extend the same thinking to building energy efficiency. It's got a huge planetary consequence for us. It's of the same character as life safety, which is something, it's a standard we accept in our world. And I think we need to, and I think a lot of the talk in the last year or two is people are beginning to accept this standard in our world, that we need to not actually asphyxiate ourselves in 2050. Please.
How about the retroactivity and property rights point?
Well, I think that also is to connect between the energy savings recipient and the front-end investor. It's a problem. It's a big problem. I think the linkage, if I understood it correctly, which I never even thought about before, of doing it via property tax abatement is a pretty good one. Because then you can connect the two. If you have a lower property tax, which reflects the energy savings, and then you can actually sell it.
Okay, there were several other questions. Yes, ma'am.
Dorothy Clay, and I have my own free enterprise energy efficiency company for residences. I've had it for 32 years. And I think the most important thing when you're dealing with residential is to make it easy for the customer, and they are not looking at what is my investment. They're looking at, is this affordable? They're not looking at the footprint, they're looking at comfort. And to basically do the right sales pitch to the right sector is what we've done. 325,000 audits, and there's a big difference between an audit and a rating that I will go into in a minute. And 80% of the people, without getting any financial incentive, have done about 90% of what we recommend. What is it we recommend? Basically, it's bringing today's energy efficiency to yesteryear's homes, paid for by tomorrow's energy savings. You have no money down as a consumer, and you pay. We focus on buyers, home buyers, because they're the ones that are most likely to look at the whole house. Yes, they want new appliances. Yes, they're worried about an air conditioner that's going to go off in a while. We work with realtors, and most of all, we try to work with the utilities and have them offer 3 types of energy: the regular energy, the clean energy, and efficiency, which will save them money. Save them money because, first of all, they can get the 30-year mortgage loan. They can get it tucked in there, and this is available from FHA in their Streamline K loan. They will either end up with more money because the waste is reduced on the average by 25%, and they choose what they want, and they may have other reasons. So what's hurting us is these government mandates. You have to do it this way. These government mandates, everybody has to have the same thing. Every house is different. Every house has a different set of things. You do have to, and you pointed this out, take into account, do they have an efficient or an inefficient? How much are they paying for their electricity? And for each person, you show them what is worthwhile for them, and that is what works.
Very interesting. Thank you. There were one or more hands up here. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thanks. Ken Langer with EMSI. We do a lot of work in China, so I'd like to go back to China for a moment because I know this memorandum of understanding has been signed. And, you know, I go around the country and even the world talking at conferences and very proudly talk about 100 projects that we're doing over there in green building and all the rest. And it's all very good and fine until I look behind me and I see the 20 billion square feet that's being built every year that's not being affected by companies like our own. And so, you know, I'm wondering, is this an opportunity with the Memorandum of Understanding and these Copenhagen talks to institute something like the program in New York, which I'm very impressed with because it seems to strike a nice balance between a mandate and a free market approach, and something one can do quite quickly. In other words, take a city like Shanghai and have a mandatory audit, but without a mandatory intervention unless there's a good payback within 5 years or whatever. And I think that kind of a bilateral program might have a lot of, you know, some teeth, because it could show the developers and the residential people in China through this demonstration project that there really is an opportunity that is, you know, good for their own pocketbooks.
Yeah, and it's energy efficiency is top on Beijing's list of bilateral cooperation when they come and talk to us. And there's a lot that we're doing together now, and there'll be a lot more that we're doing together in the years to come. The Ministry of Housing, Rural and Urban Development has a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Energy on building efficiency that they signed in July while Secretary Chu was there, and the DOE is working with Moherd on Mayor's Training Center to help bring mayors from the provinces and train them on how you improve energy efficiency, how energy efficient building policy can help mayors and local officials meet the energy intensity goals that Beijing has now pushed down to the provincial level and is a key criteria of whether mayors and governors get promotion, is whether they can improve energy efficiency. It's now tied into the job performance criteria. So there's definitely an interest there in figuring out how to do it. And it's something that we're going to learn how to do together, right? I mean, because we haven't figured out how to do that here in the U.S. and China's struggling with how you do it there. And so there's a lot of opportunities for cooperation, opportunities that pay for themselves and don't require taxpayer funding to get done.
Okay, we've reached our witching hour. I want to thank very much both Trevor and George for laying out such a fascinating analysis and array of responses. I want to again thank the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for enabling this whole exercise to go forward and asking us to join in on it. I want to thank UTC, Lafarge, and the Council for helping support this project, being here today to lead us in it, and we will look forward to continuing to work with you. I think we all learned a tremendous amount today. There's a tremendous amount to do, and thank you for helping chart the way. Meeting adjourned.